Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to this Governance for Schools webinar. The focus of our webinar today is social mobility, the impact of good governance. My name
Steve, I think you might be muted.
Thank you very much, Emma. Sorry about that, folks. It's man and machine not in perfect harmony. I do apologise. My name is Steve Barker. That's a photograph of me on the screen there. It's a rather flattering one. In other words, it's very old, but I'm here again representing Better Governor and Judicium Education, and it's my pleasure and privilege to work alongside Governor Schools in putting these webinars together for you. Um, Today is an important webinar for a variety of reasons, not least of all that it is actually a Social Mobility Day today. And I think it's important to actually understand that whilst Social Mobility Day, in terms of a lot of the fanfare and the noise around it today, is all about championing what's referred to as equitable employment opportunities for all, which of course is a great way of actually measuring the impact of what people are doing, particularly in schools as regards social mobility and encouraging and promoting it. But actually, we believe, and Governors for Schools firmly believe as well, that actually it's about more than just employment opportunities, and social mobility really from a school perspective, particularly from a school governance perspective, needs to be part of our DNA, I would suggest, as governors. It needs to be part of what we think, what we champion, and actually what we do in our governing boards up and down the country. So it's great that we're able to celebrate Social Mobility Day today, but what we're trying to encourage you to do is to think in a little bit broader spectrum about what that actually means in terms of its implications for us in schools. So the aims for the session this morning are first and foremost to explore what social mobility in the context of schools means or perhaps should mean in 2025. We're going to focus on our role as governors and trustees, both in maintained schools and academies, of course, and if it is to have impact on the future life chances of pupils in all of our schools. This shows no boundaries, of course, as to how far it can actually go. And as part of that, what we're going to try and do is clarify perhaps some of the barriers that exist in this country at the moment to social mobility, and hopefully, as I said a few moments ago, how school governance in both maintained and academy schools can actually be a force for change. As ever, this is your session, so please don't forget, if you've got any questions or comments to make going through, we'd love to hear them. If we could ask you please to use the Q&A panel rather than the chat, it's difficult to monitor both of them, but if you could do that, we'd be very, very grateful. So first and foremost, starting off with the question, what do we mean by social mobility? What is it? There are lots of organisations involved in social mobility, not least of all the government-backed Social Mobility Commission. And I thought that was actually quite a helpful place to start. So they actually asked the question on the front page of their website, and I've given you a screenshot of that on the top left-hand corner of the screen, and then I've actually given you their definition below that. And you can see that as far as Social Mobility Commission is concerned, they look at social mobility from the perspective of it being a link between a person's occupation or income and the occupation or income of their parents. And I think many of us can hopefully identify with that. Many of us will have our own stories to tell about social mobility and the impact it may or may not have had on us. And just to give you a very quick example, I as far as my parents were concerned, my father was actually a police officer, and I was brought up in the area of Hereford and Worcester, up in the Midlands, and nobody in my family had ever been to university. I was the first person in my family for well forever. It wasn't a generational thing, but I was the first generation in my family where anybody went to university and got a degree. So certainly I was probably somebody who experienced some social mobility without any doubt whatsoever. That has now had an impact because all four of my sons actually went to university. not going to go into whether there are any more than me, otherwise I might get very bitter about it. But the important thing is here that what we want to do is to think about opportunity, and the idea that today, as Social Mobility Day, is all about championing equitable employment opportunities. Those, of course, start in schools, and it's only if we think about the earliest possible intervention as far as social mobility is concerned that we're actually going to make it a reality for today's children and young people in our schools to hopefully move up in an upward direction as far as social mobility is concerned, and have the opportunity to perhaps have a different occupation to their parents, and in that way hopefully increase their earnings potential. And I thought that was an opportunity, and forgive me for quoting an old document to you here, but I'm 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 a lover of quotes. I've got several quotation dictionaries. This doesn't actually come from one, so from time to time I pick them from other places. And this was a quote that came from the Old Governance Handbook. This is pre-March 2024, when of course we had sector-specific ones introduced, for one for maintained schools and another one. But this quote came from the former publication, which, as I say, was called the Governance Handbook, for those of you who don't recall it. And for me, sums up what governance actually should all be about. And as you can see in that box on the screen in front of you at the moment, it says, effective governance is, above all, about driving relentless ambition for the children and young people served by our school system, whatever their circumstances. And the two key words in here for me, particularly relevant in today's context. First one is ambition, because we should, as governors, be driving a relentless ambition, not for the most able in our schools, not even for perhaps the most disadvantaged, but for every single child, every single young purpose. And then the next I said word, it's not a word, it's the next three words, which are the final three words in this paragraph, whatever their circumstances. And of course, that's just a reinforcement of that idea that as governors, as trustees, we are there for every single child, every single young person in our school. Um, there's a good question on the panel from Joe at the moment, and Joe's saying, can we consider social mobility beyond going to university? It seems to be generational also, that this is a measure of being successful. I think you're absolutely right, Joe. I use that as an example in my own situation, but I think there are lots of other things, and hopefully I'll have convinced you by the end of this session that that is my point, that we look at lots of different metrics, we look at lots of different opportunities that we can create. And you're absolutely right. Going to university is not the be all and end all, but for many, it's the way of opening a door to social mobilities. But it is just one of those ways. Okay, let's move on. I think it's important to actually recognise this isn't just because it's Social Mobility Day today, but this is something that is being talked about still today. It's been talked about for many, many years. That's not going to go away. I've got a couple of articles here which I've clipped from probably from the internet, actually, most of them, but I am a regular reader of The Guardian from an educational perspective, and that's actually always very helpful. And a recent article in the Guardian there on the top left of your screen was looking at some data that had actually been compiled by the Sutton Trust, and we'll say a little bit more about the Sutton Trust later, but looking at social mobility as measured by the Sutton Trust in their what's called Opportunity Index, and it was showing that geographically, London actually is far more successful, and we'll come back to that a little bit later, in terms of actually having an impact from the social mobility perspective. Now, I'm going to come back and look at the national map that was actually produced by the Sutton Trust a little bit later, but I think there's some questions that perhaps we could ponder on as governors on that. Schools Week, which is I think a very helpful publication, has lots of interesting articles, lots of relevant and topical articles as well. And they recently published an article, only last week, in fact, looking at a specific example of a school down in Devon in a very rural location, limited opportunities, etc. But this school had actually gone on a particular journey and made some significant changes to outcomes for a lot of its most deprived pupils who perhaps wouldn't otherwise have had those opportunities. Um, the Financial Times document is very much coming at this from an employer's perspective. And again, I suspect this was probably in the run up to today. This was published last week. Class is the, and it means social class here, of course, class is the missing link in employers driving diversity. And I think lots of employers are trying to drive diversity at the moment. There'll be a lot going on, hopefully, today. But I think our message here is very much that this can start in schools. Yes, employers have a really important part to play in terms of how they ensure that diversity, including diversity for all factors, including social and economic ones, of course, is actually being used, is being considered in the recruitment. And then I thought this article on the sort of bottom rightish of your screen, lack of social mobility costs the UK economy £19 billion a year. Now, this is a study that was part funded by the Co-op, but was actually reported at the last Demos gathering, and it was looking at social mobility. Not only did it come to the conclusion that Britain is one of the worst places for social mobility in the world, but it also came to the conclusion that if we're to solve some of the issues around social mobility, if we're to tackle some of those barriers perhaps to social mobility at the moment, then actually that will have a positive impact, not just on the lives of those individuals concerned, but also on the economy as a whole and business sector particularly. What I want to do now is just flash up, as I think I said in my introduction, that the concept of social mobility and the idea that we should be supporting social mobility and trying to do something about it has been talked about for quite some time. Now, this is an article that was produced by the Social Mobility Commission back in May 2016. So, yeah, this is quite a few years old now, but I think it's interesting because a lot of the things that are actually talked about here actually relate to schools. This was obviously particularly focused on the idea that the schools, as the title says, can be the engine for social mobility. And the ideas that they're talking about here, I don't want to spend a huge amount of time going into this, but the factors that they believe have a crucial impact, or they did believe back in 2016, I think are as relevant today. They're all about, first and foremost, good quality teaching, and that doesn't go away, and we'll come back to that theme later. But as you can see, the bottom of the first page there, teacher training is actually seen as one of the key drivers for improving the quality of the teaching workforce. Pay is mentioned, teacher quality in terms of making sure that CPD is actually part of the process on an ongoing basis. Again, all of them being mentioned there as potential drivers, and as I say, we will actually come back to those a little bit later. Um, I can see there's a question from Ross on the panel. Ross is saying, "Do we consider social mobility to be relative to society as a whole? Not everyone can have an above-average wage." No, absolutely, and I don't think the concept of average wage actually comes into this, Ross. To be perfectly honest, this is just hopefully a movement that says everybody should have the opportunity. I think opportunity is the key word here to actually, if you like, live a better life than maybe their parents, where it's relevant. Some people that may not be something that's relevant, but there's a huge proportion of children in our schools, young people in our schools, who perhaps, because of their experiences to date, maybe are not going to have the opportunity to do that. And if schools can actually have a bearing in terms of broadening outlooks, thinking about how we grow children and young people's aspirations outside of what's familiar to them within their own family setup, then clearly that's good for them from an opportunity perspective. But again, as I say, it's good for the economy as a whole. It's good for society as a whole. Um, I think all of us need to think about social mobility within our schools and think about, does it actually make a difference what we're doing at the moment? Are there other things that we could be doing? And we'll give you some more specific ideas on those as we go through. I can see Joe's just put a question on: is there any change since 2016 through COVID, etc. Well, interestingly, the Sutton Trust, it's something that they're looking at all of the time. This is on the left-hand side of your screen, a report that was published in June 2023, and he's absolutely talking about that issue, Joe, where they're saying that social mobility or any moves to improve social mobility and to increase it almost ground to a halt because of COVID and the impact that COVID had on lockdowns, partial closures of schools, etc. And some of the legacy issues, of course, that we've got from COVID that we've talked about in Governors for Schools webinars very often in the past few years, things like poor attendance, things like increased, perhaps unacceptable, inappropriate behaviour coming into our schools. A lot of those focus on specific groups of pupils, and they're the groups of pupils who perhaps would have the opportunity of being most influenced by greater social mobility. So I'm only flagging these two documents up here. Thanks for the prompt, Joe. My first one on the social mobility of the next generation really is to make that point that COVID has not helped the cause, and if anything, it's made a bigger divide between, if you like, the haves and the have-nots. And then the document on the right-hand side of your screen, leveling the playing fields, is again another research-driven document. It was published a couple of years ago now, but it's still very relevant. Looks at how we promote social mobility in schools, or perhaps more generally in education, as the title implies here. And we're going to come back and look at some of the suggestions in that document a little bit later as well. There's a question from Carol actually on the panel at the moment saying, does social mobility imply some move up the scale while others move down? No, I don't think it does, and certainly I don't think that would be what we're advocating or promoting at all in terms of this particular session, Carol. I think it's more about saying everybody should have the chance to succeed, irrespective of their circumstances, their family background, etc. Okay, so I've set a little bit of a backdrop in terms of some of the research, and there's a lot of research out there. There are quite a number of public bodies already very active in this field. But what can we do? What can we do in our schools and in our academy trusts up and down the country? Well, there are a number of suggestions that some of them coming out of that leveling of the playing field document I just mentioned. One of the most significant ones there is about recognizing that for some of our pupils in some of our schools, probably most of our schools, there will be barriers to them accessing opportunity and to fairer, more equitable opportunity, purely and simply because of the circumstances, their birth, their family lives, etc. So it's absolutely crucial that we understand the context, not just of our society as a whole, as Great Britain or as England and Wales, etc., but actually in the communities that our schools serve. Because context does make a difference. It has an impact on outcomes, and it's relevant for an awful lot of aspects of school governance, from attainment to safeguarding, etc. And as governors, we have to accept, we have to understand that it's crucial to understand the context before we can actually ask questions, hold our schools to account for what they're doing to try and improve the outcomes of those pupils in our schools that are impacted by perhaps a less than favourable context. Rosemary's put a comment on the panel. Functioning of our society requires many people doing many different roles. Success seems to be a very arbitrary measure. Surely the value that we place on jobs and roles in all sectors of society needs to change as much as opportunities for mobility. Yes, it absolutely does. But of course, what we also need to recognise that for the most part, education is the key that unlocks the door to perhaps a wider range of opportunities, and that's very much the drive behind this session today, Rosemary. Yes, of course, there are a range of jobs for a range of individuals with different abilities, but I think the point here is we shouldn't see that as destiny. We should make sure that everybody ends up doing something that they feel valued for doing, something that they're able to economically and socially thrive on as a result of their occupation. And that I don't think any of us would say, but that's probably the case at the moment. One of the keys to that, of course, is that we should celebrate diversity and promote real inclusion and opportunity for all. Now, it's probably a well-worn phrase, celebrating diversity. I don't apologise for that. It doesn't go away. We are in 2025 in the United Kingdom and as well as many other parts of the world, we are far more diverse than we have ever been in our history and development. That is something that we should embrace, in my view. It is something that schools do embrace and do champion. And what we should see is that all of those different groups, and again, this is just a development on from the context in the previous bullet point, all of those groups of pupils that make up those diverse communities that our schools serve, each and every one of them should have their needs, excuse me, recognised in our schools and make sure that our schools are offering opportunities for them to be included in school life, and that includes academic as well as extracurricular life in our schools, so that they do grow up with opportunities that the same as all other people would have. Whether they take up those opportunities or not, that's something else that we need to think about. But also, I think there's an opportunity for schools to celebrate social mobility. I'm not suggesting that we reel in a lot of people, old fogies like me to come and talk about how poor I was as I was growing up and look how successful I've become. That's not what this is about at all, and that absolutely isn't the message. But it is about it is actually about opportunity. So we should celebrate opportunities at every chance we get that people can end up from the perspective of where their lives start with an occupation that is wildly different from anything that anybody in their family has ever done before. Whether that actually goes hand in hand with greater economic opportunity, I guess is arguable, but most people would probably want that. Um, but I think there are opportunities for schools to celebrate that. One of my later slides, I'm talking about school alumni, but one of the things we're doing in one of the schools, one of the trusts that I'm chair of at the moment, is we are creating as part of our careers program, or our information advice and guidance as we call it, program for our students. Clearly it's a secondary school, but we're creating an alumni section on our website, and we're actually going to try and encourage people, ex-pupils, to come into school, because a lot of our pupils have actually gone on to achieve great things. They've got jobs which are worthwhile, and I'm not just talking about the highest paid jobs. I'm not just talking about the really high profile ones, but people who have actually gone on to carve out a really successful career in music, for example. And I don't mean that they're selling millions of records. They're working in music technology. Um, I've actually heard stories recently. We've got one of our ex-pupils who's a head chef of a restaurant chain in central London now. And it's that kind of thing that if we're actually giving the messages to our pupils, whatever their backgrounds, all of these things are possible. Education, as I say, is going to be the key to them, but all of these things are possible, and it's about sowing those seeds of aspiration that's key here. Because ultimately, and again, this comes back to the if you like, the buzz phrase from social mobility day to day, what we want to do is change mindsets. We want to change the views that people have that, destiny doesn't play a part or shouldn't play a part. We want opportunity for all, and that's what social mobility is actually all about. And of course, ultimately what we want is for schools to actually take positive action. And there's a whole raft of things that can come into play there, and we'll explore some of those as we go through the rest of the session. What I want to do, first of all, is just come back to that concept of barriers and think about what some of those barriers to fairer opportunity are. And when we say fair, we don't want equal opportunity, because equal opportunity doesn't always work. You can't treat everybody the same if you want to change things. But what you can do is make sure that the opportunities that are provided are offered in a more equitable way, in other words, a fairer way. And some of those barriers to perhaps fairer opportunity at the moment are represented on this slide here at the moment. It's not an exhaustive list, but hopefully it covers most things. And if you've got any suggestions for anything I've missed off the list, please feel free to put those into the Q&A box as well. But firstly, and probably the most significant one, is social and economic factors. Social and economic factors have a very clear bearing. There's no doubt about that at all. And I think it's just important to understand what we mean by socio. The economic bit, I think we all understand, but socio tends to be linked to behaviors. In other words, behaviors that we demonstrate within families, within friendships, and the way we act, interact with other people. And clearly, that is heavily dependent upon social and economic factors for, yeah, a very great extent. That also has a bearing, of course, on personal and social development. Very often, pupils that come from, shall we say, disadvantaged families in terms of socioeconomic factors don't get the same opportunities to develop personally. They don't have the same breadth of friendship groups. They don't have this. They don't perhaps take advantage of the opportunities that schools and other providers actually put out there in place to enhance their personal and their social development. So perhaps they don't tend to have as extensive friendship groups as some youngsters from other backgrounds do. We can't progress the conversation without also taking into consideration protected characteristics, of course, and those include age, disability, special educational needs, race, faith, sexuality, etc. And all of those can, they don't have to, but they can prove to be barriers for certain pupils, certain groups of pupils. And if we're thinking about social mobility from an inclusion perspective, clearly we could make some very interesting Venn diagrams here. A lot of these factors go hand in hand, perhaps with social and economic factors, etc. I'm sorry, I've just realised I missed out my third bullet point there. Third bullet point is an absolutely crucial one. Early learning is seen, certainly in all of the research papers on social mobility, to probably be the most significant factor. Whether we see parents perhaps engaging with their children in terms of talking, asking questions, sharing and playing games, reading books, etc. Those children that benefit from that early interaction tend to thrive far more successfully in schools than those that don't. And that's something that we have to take very seriously. And very often, of course, it comes in into our schools in nursery classes and reception classes very much as a deficit factor for some of our children. And that's a challenge for a lot of our schools, of course. So just going back to my list in the correct order now, expectations, of course, do we have in our schools the highest expectations? Do parents and carers have expectations as high as they should be for their children? Or is that mentality, well, this was my life, therefore that's good enough for you? Now, that might be, and I'm not criticizing that, other than the fact that that implies that we are putting a glass ceiling in place for our children and young people. And I think we have to question whether that is fair or not. Um, do we always see in our schools and actually in our children's home lives that we're modeling appropriate behaviors, appropriate ideas, appropriate concepts that actually would reinforce an ambition to be more socially mobile? I think schools generally are good at that. Doesn't mean they can't be better, but in some homes, as I say, the role modeling of an effective work ethic, appreciation for the arts, appreciation for sporting activities, etc. Those aren't there for some of our youngsters, and those can, or the absence of them, can actually be inhibiting factors to fairer opportunity. There's no doubt about that at all. I mentioned information, advice, and guidance. That happens to be what we call it in the secondary school where I'm chair. Very often referred to as careers education, but careers education makes it sound as if it's secondary specific. It's not intended to be. When we think about the information and the guidance that we provide, if not necessarily advice at primary school, but right from a very early age, from reception class, we start to actually have children recognizing that some people do certain jobs, are involved in certain occupations. Lots of reception classes inviting fire engines, ambulances, etc. We need to think about what those messages are. We need to think about how the choice of books in our school libraries, the choice of texts that are group read to children, What are the messages implicit within those to young children from all backgrounds about what the opportunity in later life is for them? And I think that's something that needs to be thought about because that very much perhaps forms a barrier at the moment. And I'm sorry, the last one is a secondary focus one, work experience opportunities. For an awful lot of pupils in a lot of our schools, work experience is a challenge in its own right at the moment in terms of making it a possibility. It has been demonstrated on many, many occasions the value that work experience brings to young people. And I think we just need to be a little bit careful that we're not using the choice of work experience placement to reinforce some of the stereotypes that will already exist and some of those barriers to greater opportunity. And there is absolutely a place for young people doing work experience in a local MOT garage or a hair salon, etc. But how do we actually select and direct or perhaps advise those youngsters that go into those? Is that always the most appropriate thing? I think we've got somebody, anonymous person here. So, whoever you are, anonymous attendee, thank you for your question. Having been in a number of schools, there's sometimes a sense that parents are a problem, and this can be entrenched by social class perceptions and attitudes. What actions can governors take to help schools bring parents who may not have the understanding of the opportunities available to their children into a collaborative relationship? Having moved to London from a small suburban town, the issue seems even starker in some ways. Thank you very much for that. I mean, I do think that's an interesting observation. I have seen that to an extent myself. I mean, part of my day job is I do visit an awful lot of schools myself. I think it's nip it in the bud as early as you can. If we're able to work with parents and carers, particularly those who perhaps haven't had particularly favourable experiences and therefore don't have good memories of education themselves, but if we can get them involved um, in their children's early learning at preschools, if that's relevant, or in nursery classes, reception classes, anything that we can do, and you'll see I'm going to mention this again a little bit later as perhaps one of the strands that we can follow up, that does break down barriers. It absolutely does. I was, as the chair of governors at an infant school as well as a secondary one, I was at the infant school a couple of weeks ago now for the welcome evening for all the new parents. And one of the messages that the head teacher gave in her speech comes right to the heart of this, and it says it doesn't matter what your child can do now. We all want for the best for our children. We want the best for your children. The earlier we get them involved in early learning, the better. When they come for their visit, and I think that their visits are next week, they will be given a reading book. They'll have the opportunity to sit with you and to go through a book. It doesn't matter whether they can read, doesn't matter whether you can read. And it's how, I mean, it's the bedside manner in many ways, I think, but all of those small ways can make a difference. And I think they're the things that as governors we should be asking questions about. We should be encouraging our parents and carers to actually think about. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. I did say a little bit, I give a little bit more information on the second bullet point from the slide before last about understanding context. I think as governors and trustees, we have to reflect a little bit on, do we know the context? Do we know it in enough detail to be able to put us in a position where we are able to hold our schools to account for what they're doing to promote social mobility? Because that might, but that's not something we can take for granted, I would suggest. Um, so, as governors and trustees, do we know those different groups of pupils that are represented in our own specific school community or trust community? Do we know which groups are already falling behind, for example, in their early reading? There will be some children that will come to school already able to recognize their name, to be able to write it down or to read it when somebody writes it for them, but there will be others that don't. What do we do to actually make sure that their needs in terms of the imperative of catching up are actually being taken into consideration? Do we know which groups don't access extracurricular provision? That can be absolutely crucial. There's been a lot of work done by the Education Endowment Foundation into the ways in which schools can, could, and should perhaps use pupil premium spending because it doesn't always have to be on academic things, and very often giving youngsters the opportunity to participate in extracurricular sporting activities, school trips, um, residential trips, I mean, where perhaps there's a contribution required. Yes, it's a voluntary contribution, but most people understand that actually it is something that needs paying. And for some youngsters, that just won't be a consideration because the parents can't afford it, and therefore it's not accessible. And also, do we know which groups are not building their social capital? Social capital, of course, is all about connections. And this is very evident at one end of the spectrum, where depending on perhaps which school you've been to, that will open doors for you. There are old boys, old girls networks, etc. But the key factor about those connections that are relevant to social capital is that they do give youngsters, they give them perhaps throughout their lives, those networks that can be of benefit to them socially, benefit to them economically. And those are the sorts of things that we need to be thinking about as part of the context of the schools in which we're governing. I said we'd come back to that Guardian article, which of course is talking about the Sutton Trust work in terms of looking at ranking, and they've done this on a political constituency basis, ranking those constituencies in terms of how good or otherwise they are as far as social mobility. And this is actually about achieving social mobility. So, in other words, taking that and accept the perhaps some of the imperfections of using this as a measure, but taking that criterion that children, young people who grow up and have perhaps job opportunities which their parents didn't have are economically and socially more comfortable than perhaps their parents were. And so the color coding on this map is the dark blue is actually where there are considered to be very high opportunities for social mobility, and the dark orangey brick red color are where it is considered to be very low, and you can see everything in between. Now, I'm not going to talk through this map other than to say yes, London is actually very much deemed as a hotspot of success as far as social mobility is concerned, notwithstanding some of the comments we've heard this morning already. But we need to think about where are we in the country? Yeah, how successful are we? In other words, are we blue, whatever shade of blue it might be, or are we on the tending towards the more pinky, orangey, reddy coloured side? Because if we are, it doesn't mean to say we're doomed to failure. It just means that we have to think about, from a governance perspective, are we asking the questions? Are our schools telling us about what they're doing to promote social mobility? Because actually, in some of those areas, it may well be that they have to perhaps try it a little bit harder than others do. And just linked to that, there's just a few facts on this next slide, which I thought I would share with you because I do think that they are relevant. In that um, Sutton Trust study, it does actually show that 51% of children in London who are eligible for free school meals, and this isn't universal infant free school meals, this is eligibility for free school meals based on that particular benefit eligibility. But 51% of those who were eligible for free school meals go on to achieve A stars to C in both English and maths. And that compares to the national average for, again, the A star to C in English and maths of only 36%. So whatever it is in London, and the study, poses a few questions and speculates a little bit on that, but whatever it is happening, it seems to be having an impact. And I think all of us, if we're not in London, should be asking the question, well, hang on a minute, what are they doing? What could we do? What would work here, etc. And if we are governors of schools in London, again, are we as successful as the average? Are we better than that average? Are we below that average? But more than important than anything else, what more could we do, of course? Interestingly, the study also shows that the lowest performing local authority areas, that means, of course, in terms of performance of disadvantaged pupils, and disadvantage is, of course, the name that the government actually gives to those eligible for free school meals. Fewer children on free school meals actually attend a school that Ofsted have previously rated as good or outstanding. They're more likely to attend a school that isn't a good or outstanding school. And that's something to think about. And then not necessarily linked to performance, but there is a causal relationship here without any doubt whatsoever. The study then goes on to actually point out that disadvantaged pupils generally are twice as likely as non-disadvantaged pupils, that means, to actually become NEET within a year of their GCSEs. And NEET is not in employment, education, or training. So, in other words, they are likely to be going down a road that is not going to lead to them being able to improve their social mobility at all. I can see we've got another comment on the panel here. I would apologize if it's the same person, anonymous attendee, or if it's a different one. Thank you very much anyway, that's great. So he's just saying, I agree with Rosemary. I feel some of the jobs in society are not as well paid when you compare to technical roles, for example. I feel teachers and nurses should be paid more. They're key to society and other roles like these. For society to function, all roles are needed, from cleaners to bankers. Couldn't agree with you more. And that really, yeah, that's part of this process. But of course, part of this process of social mobility is recognizing it doesn't actually matter what job you do, but do you feel it's a job that you want to do? Do you feel that you had opportunities to make other choices if that was something you felt? Yes, of course, we should value everybody and all, but actually, not everybody can become an investment banker and earn multi-million pound money. Not everybody can go on to be a Premier League footballer or yeah, achieve highly and whatever. But actually, what we should be doing is making sure there are opportunities for people to do what they want to get to where they want to be. And it's the inequality, I think, at the moment that is probably the key driver for what we're talking about here. So, what should we do as governors? First and foremost, well, I think there are a number of things that we could do, but firstly and foremost, I think challenging the status quo is really important. Just because we have always done things the way that we've done, just because we hear comments like, well, they come from, this particular estate, they come from that particular area of the school's catchment, so they're not going to perform as well, are they? These are the youngsters that it's reflected in their whether or not they achieve a good level of development in early years, goes on to SATs at the end of Key Stage 2, etc. And very often those are entrenched feelings within school communities, and dare I say, sometimes even held by us as governors. We shouldn't do that. We really shouldn't. We should actually be asking, well, why can't everybody achieve like this? What would we need? What would we need to do in order to uh, raise that bar for everybody so that they do have the same opportunities as perhaps the most advantaged in our society? Certainly, as governors, we should seek assurance from our school leaders about how early reading, is promoted and prioritised in the school, and I mean for all pupils there. Um, we will know each year, if you're a governor in a primary school, you look at your early years outcomes and you see that as far as the proportion of youngsters getting good level of development at the end of year R is concerned, there's a good chunk of them who are losing out because they're not getting the right scores in the communication category, which includes reading, of course. Now, if they're not good readers, and they have to be good readers, but if they're not actually reaching the expectation in terms of their development of language and communication at the end of early years, what additional focus do we put on for them in the early part of Key Stage 1 so that by the time they get to the end of year 1, they are achieving better in the phonics check? By the end of Key Stage 1, if we're still doing SATs, are they reaching the standard we'd expect of them? And certainly by the end of Key Stage 2, are we actually saying, yes, the interventions we've done in terms of promoting early reading has been absolutely successful because these are the scores we're getting? I think it's very easy to again see this as a destiny path if we're not careful. As governors, we most certainly should not be doing that. And I can see question from Carol on the panel now. How do you define early reading? Early reading is not defined by me, it's defined by the government, and it's the idea that we need children to be as fluent in reading as possible at as early an age as possible, because reading is the, if you like, the gateway to the rest of the curriculum. If you can't read, you're going to have difficulty accessing other areas of the curriculum. So prioritizing early reading through synthetic phonics schemes, etc., is an absolutely crucial part of that. Um, it's a focus of the Ofsted framework at the moment, and probably will continue to be, how early reading is promoted. And of course, early reading is about the stage a child's at. It's not necessarily about their age. It'd be great if it was about age for everybody, but it's about everybody recognising, not just in infant schools, Key Stage 1, but actually in Key Stage 2 and even in secondary schools. If you've got pupils coming and joining your schools who aren't fluent, proficient readers, what are you doing to actually enhance their access to early reading so that they can move on to that greater fluency? We should also be seeking assurance that, once we know who these pupils are, that interventions, support for them is actually being put in place, which actually helps, hopefully, in attacking some of those barriers that some of these pupils might have in their paths. We should question, as I've alluded to already, how pupil premium grant is actually being spent. In lots of our schools, it's still being spent on the same things it was in 2011, 2012, when it was first introduced. We're now in 2025, so 13, 14 years later, if we're still spending it on the same things and we're not dramatically improving outcomes for disadvantaged children, as governors, we should be questioning, are we making the right decisions here? Had a question a few moments ago about definitions. I wonder whether perhaps in all of our schools we shouldn't, as governors, be asking our schools to perhaps think again and redefine what we actually mean by inclusion. Inclusion for many schools is limited to special educational needs and disabilities, making sure we can, wherever possible, include them in most of our activities. It can go beyond that, it really can. And of course, what it does, again, it says to us as governors, are we the ones that could be championing the shifting of mindsets? Again, coming back to that focus of social mobility day to day. All those things on the previous slide are things that I think we should be doing, but there's a whole list beyond that that goes into actually what we could be doing. And again, I think a lot of this is coming back to some of those conclusions from some of those earlier reports. It's about knowledge, it's about knowing. So, do we actually encourage our schools to analyse how socially mobile they are? What are we actually doing to help the most disadvantaged, to help those that don't necessarily perform as well as others to actually improve? And are we challenging our schools to do more? Because we could. We could challenge our schools to broaden access to experience. Now, I'm aware that the clock is ticking by, though, so I don't want to take too long on this. But some of the things that I'm not sure I should be particularly proud of this, but I think I am. A school that will remain nameless that I was a governor at many, many years ago was very pleased with the fact that every year as a junior school, it went on a skiing trip to the French Alps and took a number of children who had a lovely time without any doubt whatsoever. I pointed out that the school had a very diverse catchment, and therefore those children that got the opportunity to go skiing, that was actually quite an elitist thing to do. A lot of them went skiing with their parents anyway, but there was probably about 80% of the school population who could never afford that, wouldn't see it within yeah, their outlook on life as something appropriate for them to do anyway, and therefore it wasn't the right thing to do. Wouldn't we be better offering opportunities in terms of extracurricular activities, enrichment activities, and the experiences allied to those that are accessible to all? And that's the kind of championing we ought to be doing as governors. Um, has to be said, I did stop the ski trip because of my questions, which lots of people didn't like me for, but I actually felt was the right thing to do. We should explore alternative and impactful ways of spending pupil premium. We should look at some of the things that enhance and build that social capital that we talked about earlier. Are we actually building children's personal and social development as a consequence of what we're doing? Because actually that probably makes a huge difference. It makes as much difference as developing them academically. We should be encouraging a culture of ambition for everybody. We shouldn't be accepting that, the destiny proposition, because that's not appropriate. We should support parents and carers to promote ambition. So again, might start with early reading. It might start with participation in extracurricular enrichment activities, etc., and particularly championing again those non-elitist activities um, as a way, really, of encouraging our schools to promote the broadening, the widening, whatever you want to call it, of participants of school life. And that comes down to using the school library. There are some children that don't take books home. Why not? Why aren't we encouraging that? There are some families who never participate in PTA activities, etc. Do we take extra steps to break down some of those barriers to give them the opportunity to come? Some of that might be linked to economic factors. Does the school have the option to subsidise those, etc.? All of those are things that we should be encouraging as governors our schools to do, because all of them are actually about breaking down barriers, I would suggest. Um, Few examples here very quickly, and you'll get these in the slides that will be distributed after the event. So championing early reading, for example, that can be done through encouraging parents to read, to talk to their children, and that might include adult literacy support. There are many schools that put that on. Encouraging parents to actually come in and stay with their child and read for 10 minutes at the beginning of the day, and then stay an extra half hour for those that want to, those that need it, to actually do some adult literacy support, perhaps with a teaching assistant. Using pupil premium to fund extracurricular activities for disadvantaged pupils. That might be whole school cinema trips. It might be bringing in theatre, dance groups, etc. There's a whole host of things that can be done. The school in Devon that I mentioned in the Schools Week article that had been particularly successful, one of the things that they were doing, it was a secondary school, and they were providing revision classes for all of their pupils, but with a particular focus on targeting disadvantaged pupils who they felt could benefit most. And they were actually providing transport home after the classes, because otherwise there would be an affordability issue of using public transport, etc. There are a range of charities out there who can actually support schools in a whole variety of means, including providing aspiration raising activities. And I think it's something that all of us need to think about. I happen to be involved with a charity, and we support a lot of schools in taking groups of children to literature festivals. We take them to on theatre trips, sporting activities, etc. Opportunities they wouldn't ordinarily have, and that's about opening minds. It's about giving them the opportunity to recognise that future isn't actually carved in stone for you. There are opportunities, there should be opportunities for you to be what you want. And I mentioned the celebrating the alumni a little bit earlier. Just wanted to, in the last couple of moments, really just point this article out. It's secondary education. I don't think of course, the title is secondary specific. The principles that this is actually talking about in terms of building blocks for schools to use in terms of their efforts to boost social mobility, I think are as applicable in primary as they are in secondary for the most part. And on this slide, I've just put those seven in abbreviated form, but the whole school ethos is crucial, of course. If social mobility is to become a reality, we need to ensure that our schools across the board are supporting, are promoting it, and it's actually running through the blood of the school ethos, shall we say. Behaviour and attendance issues need to be addressed. If children aren't in school, first of all, they're not going to benefit from all of those opportunities that help build social mobility. And certainly making education exciting, motivating, enticing for all has a huge impact on addressing behavioural issues. High quality teaching we've talked about already. Part of that, of course, is the identifying, sorry, and then meeting individual learning needs. Staff deployment is an interesting one. Do we deploy staff appropriately? Staff very often are put with youngsters with special educational needs. Lots of our primary schools do it on a one-to-one basis because they feel the need to. But actually, what difference is that making across the board in terms of social mobility? A little bit of thought, a little bit of perhaps review and reflection on that could make a huge amount of difference. Being driven by the data, so looking at your context, looking at outcomes and prior attainment, all of those make a real difference. And last but by no means least on the list, it comes down to leadership. And leadership, of course, absolutely includes governance. There should be clear and responsive leadership. And I think the secondary ed article is talking about clear and responsive leadership in terms of respond to your context, respond to those children's needs, respond to what you see going on about you on a day-to-day basis, looking to celebrate where we are doing things that actually make a contribution to social mobility. And a final thought from me, and then we'll open up to more questions if there are any. I think as governors, we need to reflect. We need to reflect on our own composition as a board. Do we reflect that the needs, the aspirations for structures within the communities that we support as governors, and do we include those who actually represent social mobility in our governing bodies and can actually help in championing it as a force in our schools? And of course, that does require us to hold the mirror up to ourselves. But personally, I think that's something we should be doing. I think we should be saying, how effective are we? We can rest on our laurels and talk about how wonderful we are in terms of being X number of points above the national average for SATs at the end of Key Stage 2. We can talk about our phonics scores. We can talk about our GCSEs and how many youngsters get into Oxford and Cambridge and the other red brick universities each year. But actually, what are we really doing? Are we really being successful in championing social mobility in our schools? Because actually, as governors, we should, because we should be about ambition, we should be about opportunity. That's all I'm going to say to you this morning, folks. But as I say, if there are any outstanding questions, now is your opportunity to ask those. Questions on anything that we've included in the session this morning, or anything that we've not included that you perhaps think we might have done, please do feel free to ask those questions. Or perhaps we've stunned you into silence. Think about those. If there are any questions, do send them across. But whilst you're doing that, just on a final linked theme. Today is Social Mobility Day, of course, and Governors for Schools are offering another webinar at lunchtime today, and starts at 12 p.m. So if you know anybody who's perhaps considering becoming a governor, this is a great opportunity to point them in the direction of this webinar. Tune in and have a look at what the role of governors is, what difference they can actually make in their schools, and ultimately what becoming a governor actually does for you in terms of your own personal development, but also what it does for the children and young people in our schools. And of course, that's why we are governors, hopefully, because we do want to support children and young people in our schools, particularly on a journey of social mobility, if that's an appropriate one for them to make. Okay, I see one question's come in from Laura. Thank you very much, Laura. Laura's saying, is there support for young and early career teachers to help them become more aware of the wide range of professions and post-18 work that's available to our students? I'm guessing from the way that you've worded that you're in a secondary environment, Laura. I think in the secondary schools, there are statutory responsibilities with regard to careers guidance or information advice and guidance that's offered. And part of that would be, and again, I realise it actually might vary a little bit from school to school depending on size. Part of that is to deliver careers advice and guidance to pupils. So yes, training would be available, but hopefully schools will have, they'll at least have a careers advisor or access to them. But certainly early career framework teachers should be asking questions if they're not getting access to the CPD that they think they need to encourage them to, sorry, not encourage, to enable them rather to perform their role effectively. They should actually be asking that. First instance, talk to their mentor or talk to the institution that they're being monitored by. We've got another question, sorry, comment from Ross. Ross is saying, just to comment, your final question. Sorry, my question panel's jumping around a bit as others are coming in. Your final question about the makeup of governing bodies is a great point. We really struggle to encourage those from diverse socioeconomic range to join. All of the factors that affect children's mobility also affect their parents' ability to get involved. I think you're absolutely right, Ross, and that's the reason for putting that last slide in. I think as governors, we have a responsibility to make governance more acceptable, more accessible, more inclusive. And that means from everybody in our society. So I think we have to think about the way we operate. We have to think about the language we use. We have to think about how we can be seen as perhaps being less anxiety causing. Lots of people, as whatever their background, first governor meeting can be seen as quite an intimidating challenge. What do we do to break down those barriers? What do we do to actually make governance real for all people? We can still perform our functions. That's not a problem at all. There are some constraints, shall we say, about governance because there's a business side of it to be done. But actually, we could encourage more people from a more diverse range of backgrounds. And I think we need to hold that mirror up to ourselves, as I say, to actually think about ways in which we could do that and make it a reality. And then there's a question from Rick has just come through. Many thanks, Rick. Sorry, I'll make this the last question because it is 9 o'clock now and the minutes are ticking away. So Rick's saying, are there any options for primary school to review the life outcomes achieved by all pupils who spend critically important early years in school, so that once they've gone to secondary and then into adult life, we are effectively blind to the social mobility impact? Yeah, to an extent you are. I think there are things that we can do in primary schools. There are things that nursery schools can do, which hopefully broaden minds and actually make others aware of those opportunities. I think liaison communication from the schools that they go to, schools aren't always able to track every single pupil, but yeah, when we do hear something, celebrate it. I had a wonderful experience a couple of weeks ago. I was interviewing for a new teacher at the infant school where I'm chair with the head teacher, and one of the candidates used to attend the school. Well, that's lovely, and it happens to be a very nice piece of social mobility as well. But actually celebrating that kind of thing, I think, is a good way to do it. Okay, folks, well, that does bring us to the end of the session this morning. So just to say thank you very much indeed for attending. Do come back to the next session we've got. As I say, if you can persuade people to tune in at midday today, that would be great as well. The sun is shining where I am. I hope it is where you are too. Enjoy the rest of your day, and thank you very much indeed, and goodbye.